Welcome to Soft Pass, hosted by John Michaels, a 30-year veteran tour manager and sound engineer for some of entertainment's most well-known touring acts. And Alan Tillis, a mild-mannered writer and entertainment lawyer by day and a rowdy musician by night. Join them as they sit down with songwriters, musicians, producers, managers, and touring professionals to talk about what really goes on behind the scenes in the studios, offices, and on stage in the entertainment industry.
Welcome to another edition of Soft Pass. I'm John Michaels. In this episode, we have a couple of longtime heavy hitters who have been playing in bands for roughly 50 years each. That's 100 years worth of rock in a one-hour show, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. First, let's say hello to my co-host, Mr. Alan Tillis. Alan, how are you doing today?
I am doing incredibly well. I'm so excited for tonight as we get to talk to two of my favorite musicians from favorite bands. They're responsible for two of my favorite songs of all time and had the pleasure of talking with them at various times at length. So this is just a delight for me.
Yeah, and they're both very affable and fun guys to talk to, so I think it's going to be a really great show. Our first guest is a Philly native, but he grew up in Los Angeles. His father was an actor, radio, and television star. The band he was in first was a little project called Canned Heat, but he left before they signed a recording contract. He then became a founding member of what would be the legendary LA band Spirit. In the 70s, he moved to Boulder, Colorado, and joined the band Firefall. And after 6 years with them, he moved back to L.A. and joined Heart and toured with them through the 80s. He worked in the studio with Joe Walsh, Dan Fogelberg, Whitesnake, Kim Carnes, and many others. The guy has a lot of friends. When I tour with him, I keep a separate guest list just for him. And then sometimes even my friends show up on this guy's guest list. It's crazy. He's been back with the band Firefall since 2014 and currently lives in Houston, Texas with his wife, Valerie. He ties Kenny Aronoff for the title of the nicest guy in rock and roll. Please welcome my good friend and an exceptional talent, Mr. Mark Andes.
Hey, you guys. Nice to see you. Thank you, John, for that lovely intro. Good to hear your voice, Alan. And Lance, this is going to be fun, dude.
It should be a good show. Our second guest, since the cat's already out of the bag, was born in a little town called Greenport, New York, and he was recruited by his brother Larry at the age of 18 to move to Woodstock, New York, and play bass in his band, then a three-piece consisting of his brother, a guy named John Hall, and another guy named Wells Kelly. The band took their influence from a diverse background of soul, R&B, the Memphis sound, Cajun music, the Beatles, the Beach Boys, and whatever else they could get their ears on. They were actually one of the first bands to play reggae in America. Their name, Orleans, based off of their affection for Louisiana music, and their sound, which was once categorized as middle of the road, has survived close to 50 years now. And we have one of the last two original men standing, Mr. Lance Hoppen, with us. And in addition to Lance playing with his band Orleans, he's graced the stage with artists like Joe Elliott, John Resnick, Billy Ocean, The Temptations, Sebastian Bach, Natasha Bedingfield, even Daryl Mack from Run DMC, plus 100 other names we don't have time to mention. He's played in bands with the likes of Garland Jeffries, Susie Bogus, John Jorgensen, and Albert Lee. He's played on a #1 jazz record, a #1 country record. You can often see him outside his band Orleans playing with Felix and the Rascals or with his local Nashville band, the Rocket Men. And he's even been known to fill in for our first guest, Mark Andes, in Firefall from time to time. Fly Amaro wanted me to introduce you as Gandalf the Grey, but I told him the person with the biggest mane runs the pride. He shouldn't be so jealous. But please welcome the still handsome, with a full head of hair, and extremely talented musician and singer, Mr. Lance Hoppen. Lance, welcome to the show.
Oh, geez, John, I didn't know I'd done so much stuff.
You know, I end up doing a lot of research, and actually, that's how we chose the guests for this episode. I said, get me the guys who still have a nice full head of hair after 70 years, because they're going to be the least stressed out dudes.
Just lucky, I guess.
or maybe this episode is subtitled, It's All About the Bass.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have two bass players, so we might as well start kicking off the drummer jokes. Lance, did you want to start with taking a shot at Charlie? Or?
Charlie?
Oh, Charlie? I have too much respect for Charlie Morgan. I'll pass.
We're all friends anyway. Let's start off real quick. Mark, first off, Tell us what it was like living in the thick of it in Los Angeles in the mid to late 60s. Like, where were your local watering holes? Where did everybody meet up on the weekends, and who was in the scene? Like, what was it like?
Well, I was lucky enough I'm old enough to have grown up in the 50s and 60s and on up. And my dad, being an actor, we sort of had the Hollywood scene around. I kind of grew up in that whole thing. So it was kind of amazing, but it was not unusual for us to be around stars or to go visit a movie set, and then later starting bands and being in the scene, kind of, as you say.
Well, that's what I'm saying. You were right in the thick of the scene. So, like, who were you hanging out with? Like, where were you guys hanging? Were you at the Troubadour? Who was in the group, so to speak?
In the 60s, we're jumping ahead because in the 50s, people like Julie London would come to our family's parties and sing. So I go way back. My dad knew Lucille Ball. And jumping into the 60s, we were at the Ash Grove. Our haunt was basically, there was the Troubadour and there was the Ash Grove. The Ash Grove was a little more traditional, a folk blues coffee shop that was owned and run by Randy Wolf's uncle, Ed Pearl. The Rising Suns got their start there, and Mance Lipscomb and serious blues and folk artists would play there. And we were called the Red Roosters at that point, had a dark night was given to us. They put a kind of a skeleton crew on board for us, so they would sell drinks and coffees and stuff. And we just started playing. I think it was like a Monday night, and gradually built up a pretty good-sized following. And that was originally called the Red Roosters, and that developed into the Spirits Rebellious, and then we became Spirit ultimately. So the scene was kind of wide open and crazy. Love and the Birds were just breaking. The Seeds were going out. We would play places like Pandora's Box and The Trip. I mean, it was all it was cracked up to be, so to speak.
Did your dad ever tell you what it was like to work with Marilyn Monroe in Clash by Night?
Not specifically, but I do remember a legendary blowout with my parents when Keith, my father, was scheduled to make an appearance with Marilyn at UCLA, and a knockdown drag-out ensued. And I really don't recall whether or not he made the event. He probably did, but there was obviously no romantic interest there. But I did actually we visited the set. They were shooting the beach scenes. It was basically a Barbara Stanwyck film, and we got to see them actually perform. It's hard to see people, when they're filming, but they have the reflectors. They have these big panels of reflective material, probably aluminum foil or something. I actually got to see Marilyn work with my old man. It was kind of crazy.
Wow,
And it was directed by Fritz Lang. So, he directed Metropolis, a German director. Was there any interaction that you had with Fritz or your dad spoke about? How was he to work with?
That was not something I discussed, and I did not recall an interaction with Mr. Lang, but I do remember being a frequent guest on my dad's projects, and I got a ton of stories, but on that particular instant, I think maybe we were so young, I don't recall Fritz Lang, but later we got to interact with more of the stars and the directors and producers and stuff.
Speaking of family, Lance, you came from a musical family. Your mom and dad played music, your brothers played music, and even when your parents were done with music and moved down to Florida, they rediscovered it. It's pretty clear that music runs in the family. When you first picked up an instrument, was there an immediate bond? Like, was it in your DNA, or did you have to really work at it?
Boy, you have done your homework. Yeah, so my folks were players. They met right after World War II, and my dad was a trumpet player and good, and my mom was a singer and piano player and off the chart good, like gifted. So that's where the genes come from for all of us Hoppen kids. We always had music in the house. Singing came from an early age. I was terribly, terribly, painfully shy, and my mom had to bribe me with like, here's $1 if you'll sing at the party, and I still wouldn't do it. So it's like that. It was always in the house, and we were always being educated. My older brother, Larry, who you spoke of before, he was prodigious, and he could play anything he picked up, he could play by ear. He learned keyboards and guitars and he learned all that stuff. And he played trumpet too in band. And then when I got to fourth grade, my dad came home from a pawn shop with a clarinet and handed it to me. Here you go, kid. And I remember I cried because I didn't want to play clarinet. But I did for 8 years. And that's where I got my more formal training. And in the shadow of my older brother and his first bands and such, I was too intimidated to strike there. But once he left for college, and he did early, he graduated 2 years early. So he got out of the house. There was a guitar in the closet. So I took it out and started plunking on one string and gravitated toward McCartney bass lines. That's how I got started. And then you couldn't pull me away from it. Kid, if you don't do your chores, you can't play bass. And so it was one of those. So I learned from one string, there's 3 other strings. How do they interrelate? And it was just that kind of process. Music was always part of our culture in the house. We weren't forced to do it. Everybody was just, that was our gift. That was our calling.
It was just one of those families, just kind of naturally
Right.
Music all around all the time. Mark, did you play another instrument besides bass before you played bass?
Yeah, I played guitar. A similar history as Lance, really, because music was always around. And
Did you get a clarinet too?
Hey, no criticism of clarinet players. I wound up at fourth grade also carrying a permission slip to elementary school to play clarinet because my dad played saxophone. So,
and Benny Goodman's a badass, so there you go.
That's right.
But piano was the first thing I was introduced to. That was kind of a prerequisite back in the day. And then guitar. We had a really wonderful family friend, Rami Idris, Uncle Rami, who was a session guy and a decent engineer in the 50s. And we got some rudimentary guitar lessons, and early on piano, just got a little bit of theory going on, and then guitar, and then Link Ray released Rumble, as I recall, and Little Richard came along, and it really, really set me off onto that whole train of thought musically. And then I had I think it was the first band I had in high school. The bass player, who was an accomplished guy, left the band. We needed a bass player. So my brother, Matt, who was the slide player in Jo Jo Gunne, who's a really good guitar player to this day, he took over the guitar chores and I switched to bass. Kind of started on guitar, but switched to bass out of kind of a necessity thing.
So both of you play with siblings at one point or another. Is that a difficult thing?
It's an intensifier, I think. So when things are really good, they're really good. And when they're not so good, they're not so good. But my early on dream, as a kid, a tweenie even, was not to be famous. It was to be a professional player. That's what I wanted to do. And I wanted to do it with my older brother. And lo and behold, that all happened. And between my age of 18 and 23 or so, that was our heyday, So my dream came early, fulfillment. And I forgot what your question is, but that's how I answered it.
I can just see your mom now saying, "Can't you include your younger brother?"
Well, Lane had a different path. He also studied. He was a trumpet player. He studied keyboard. My mom was a piano teacher. One of my big regrets, I would not let her teach me. I couldn't do it. That's a skill I don't have. So Lane, he wasn't in our band. He was in other bands. He went to Juilliard for a year. He got some stuff under his belt, and he struck out on his own and did his own path. And, now and again he would cameo. We had him in Orleans, actually, in like a third generation, like 82 to 84, something like that. And now he's a full...
I didn't know he went to Juilliard, man. That's
yeah,
great.
he did. He put his theory time in there. So that's why he can do all these charts and read, and he does all these horn arrangements for me, things like that. I don't have those skills. So he had a stint in Orleans in the early 80s and then some cameos along the way. And then he came back full time with us. We had him come around 1999 or 2000, and he's been here ever since. And he's become a very integral part of who we are.
Yeah, he's great. Mark, when you left Spirit in 71 to go play with your sibling, was it because your attempts to secretly take over the band failed?
To secretly take over Spirit?
You were accused of secretly trying to take over the band.
Really? Actually, it was pretty much a democracy back then, and Randy was just really blossoming during the 12 Dreams of Dr. Sardonicus era. But Randy just had some issues that were just intolerable. And I had no desire to be. But maybe that wound up what you just described as me trying to take over the band. Maybe that's what got me fired from Jo Jo Gunne, because that was the band with my brother and Jay, who was my best friend since junior high school. And they fired my ass, man. I got fired from Jo Jo Gunne, and I said, well, this is not good. And I left Topanga, and I moved to Colorado. Unbeknownst to me, Topanga and Laurel Canyon all happened to move to Colorado at the same time. So I thought I was getting out of Dodge and losing all these people, and they were already there. So I went, oh God.
I was going to ask you what the impetus was to move to Colorado, but I guess that's it.
Yeah, I got fired from my own band, and that was pretty intense, especially when my brother and my best friend were involved in it.
Right. I got fired too, just for the hell of it. I'll chime in here. Left behind would be a better way of expressing it. So the upswing was 72 to 77, and that's when John Hall first left the band abruptly. I was the last guy to know, actually. So Post's still the one about a year later, and then he just too much, young man bulls in the china shop. So he left. And then in the reformation process of Orleans Mach 2, advice was given from the powers that be that maybe Larry should get somebody else and not me. So that went down where I was out of the band. And then the new collection, Wells and Larry and new guys made a series of demos. And at some point they decided, I forget why, that I should be in the band. So we reconvened, made the Forever album with Love Takes Time in it. In the middle, though, I have to tell you, so I got fired from the band and I went to work with one of our drummers who'd left, when John left, Jerry Murata, who has stellar career since then. And he was putting a band together for Garland Jeffries, who's kind of a cult hero. This is 78. So no more Orleans. And Jerry puts me in the band with Garland. There was one guy that didn't fit. So he got ousted, and it was like, who are we going to get? And I said, well, let's get Larry. Of course, Larry had just fired me, right? So
a glutton for punishment, huh, Lance?
Right. So I suggested to Jerry we get Larry, and of course, Larry got in the band, and then we had that went for like whatever time, and then maybe that's how I got back in Orleans. I forget. And then we went on to greater things, the crash and burn cycle, as it were. Happens many times.
Speaking of that time period, tell us a little bit about ABC Records and Dance With Me and Let There Be Music, and how a presentation of a song can change things a great deal.
Right. So the quick story on ABC, I joined the band. It was a trio. It was kick-ass. Boy, they were so great as a trio. But they wanted to expand. So I came in October 72. We hunkered down. We went in this New York City in the spring of 73 to showcase. We played this place in Greenwich Village every Tuesday night. So Tommy Cashman and West saw us there, and they brought us to ABC, but we didn't want to be produced by them. We got rid of them, and we went up with Roger Hawkins and Barry Beckett. That was the first album. And then the second album, we produced ourselves, right? We said, oh, we can do this. So
was that the Bearsville one?
Bearsville studio, yeah. And we went in and we, self-produced. And John Hall had some experience. He had produced a Bonnie Raitt album, and he had a couple albums of his own. So we kind of had an idea. So there were 9 tracks on that record, and one of them was Let There Be Music, and another was Dance With Me, both in their fledgling original versions. And we turned in the record, and ABC hated it. They did not release it. They released us. So
they released it in Europe, right?
It only went out in the Netherlands because for some reason we had a cult following from the first record over there. But that's a whole nother story. So
you guys in Spinal Tap.
The audience was becoming more selective, as it were. So we went back to New York, back to Kansas City this time. We played this 1 week, 2 shows a night, 3 on the weekend.
Oh, no.
6 or 7 days in a row. If I'm not mistaken, and the legend goes, on the very last show of the last night, well, we were shot and our voices were fried and all that. Chuck Plotkin, who was the head of A&R at Asylum, had heard the buzz and came down to see us and signed us. He liked what he heard. So he signed us to Asylum. He produced the Waking and Dreaming album, which is the one with the, bare-chested.
One of the worst album covers of all time.
Yeah, it has suffered terrible ridicule over the years, but it's good press. Right? And he bought the rights from ABC to re-record Let There Be Music and Dance With Me. And in his producer's wisdom, knew what to do with them to turn those songs into hit records. And that's how that happened.
Who was the guy at ABC that passed on him? Who was the A&R guy? Do you remember?
Well, Cashman, forget his name, Tommy West and producers of Jim Croce and such had brought us to the label, but we divested of them. We didn't want that kind of production. So we wound up with the Muscle Shoals team for the first album. And then we wound up with ourselves, the second album, which was, I guess, overly indulgent would be one way to put it. And then that's what got us fired from ABC and released us to do Asylum, which was a good thing.
That's so interesting, Lance, that you wound up on Asylum because Jo Jo Gunne was the second artist signed to Asylum. David Geffen had just signed Jackson Browne, and we were the second artist signed to Asylum, and then the Eagles were the third group. That's so interesting that we have that in common. That's fun.
That's not bad company.
Right. Well, the story for me was, the good news is you're on Asylum. The bad news is, Mark, you're leaving.
Oh, right. You get fired by your family. I want to fast forward a little bit with you, Mark, to 1984 and the Spirit of 84 album. You re-record a couple of the tunes, and from what I understand, when you did the remake of one of my favorite tunes, I Got a Line on You, just an incredibly awesome version that you did, 7+ minutes on the album, that was recorded live on a soundstage. Did I read that right?
That's a true thing. It was one of the first digital recordings. We did it at the soundstage. It was the big soundstage on A&M.
Probably the same one that Burley and Ambrosia played at for their tryout.
Yeah, and we did the whole thing live. On that particular cut, Alan, we had everybody, Bobby LeKine from the Doobies and Skunk. We had a lot of the Doobies. There was Gary Myrick.
Skunk Baxter. Bob Welch.
Yes, there's a lot of people that are no longer with us on that video. It was a real special thing. We'd had no audience, so it was just musicians and cameras and stuff. That was kind of a special record, Alan, yeah.
All of those instruments couldn't have been going. Was that all mixed? Everybody was like on that take? There was like 37 guitar players in there.
Yeah, Howard Leese was on there. And, to be honest, I'm not sure how the mixing took place. I was not involved in.
Well, it was 84. I don't think a lot of people remembered it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Howard, I was already in Heart at that point. I had 2 years into being in Heart. So I did that project, but I was not really invested in the mixing and the production and stuff. So there was probably some sweetening stuff. But yeah, man, that was a special record. Thanks for remembering, Alan.
So the video that's on YouTube of you all playing, that wasn't staged? That is you all playing live?
I think.
Wow.
Pretty much.
Wow.
That's my warped recollection.
Oh, just an incredible version. I urge everybody to check it out. We're going to put both the long and short on our website.
We'll post it. Yeah, we'll post them both. Speaking of a bunch of very talented people being in one spot, Lance, being from the Woodstock area in the early 70s, did you have a lot of encounters with like Levon and Dylan and Paul Butterfield and Rundgren and all those guys? I mean, was it just everybody kind of hung out up there, or what was the scene like?
Yes and no. You got to understand, I was a kid, I was totally the kid. I was 18, 19. Everybody was older, more accomplished, and I was ultimately intimidated, my shy self. So I said something to Butterfield in Deanie's, which was the hangout, drink it all you want restaurant, right? Something about Emmylou Harris. Really, she's a good singer, and I mean that's not up his alley, right? So he kind of like turned his back on me, that kind of thing. I would brush with those guys, not Dylan. Might have run across Danko, but more to the point, there were a couple of clubs in town that were hopping every 5 nights a week or such. There were 3 at one point, actually. Played them all, and I played in different bands there, local conglomerates, bands with Robbie Dupree and other locals. We had a cover band, for fun. Guys like Sanborn would play there all the time. Or
Well, like, what was a typical Saturday night at those three clubs? Like, who would be playing?
you might have Howard Johnson's tuba band play, or anybody from out of town. But all these hotshots, Buzzy Featon, all come into town playing the Joyous Lake as we did. And that was the scene in the early 70s there. There was a lot of music like that. I want to digress for a minute so I don't forget to say this. Mark, what you don't know about me is that when I was learning bass, Larry was a big influence in me. He had a lot of cool records. He had Love, and he had Crazy World of Arthur Brown, and that's where I heard
great
Rod
record.
Stewart sing with Jeff Beck on True, stuff like that, right? But he had the first Spirit record. And so some part of learning bass was playing Fresh Garbage, Someone to Tell My Mother I Died, all those songs, they were part of my
nice thing to
initial,
say.
how do we play bass? So I was learning from you.
And I've been trying to sing as good as Lance for years now.
Wow, you've been learning Mark Andy's part for your whole career now.
Did that make harmonies easier or harder when you have folks in the same family? Do you wind up with similar voises?
Yeah, there's a thing. It's like a Bee Gees thing.
There's
right?
a sibling. There's a sibling.
There's a genetic similarity that's, I don't know how overt it is, but you hear it in family voices. Larry and I always blended. Lane sounds a lot like me tonally. We're all different, but there's something about it that when you put it all together, it just works. Yeah, it was great to sing with John, but if we substituted somebody for John, it still sounded good. Give me any baritone and put it with Larry and me, and it'll sound like Orleans.
Is it John that's doing the low part on Still the One?
That the actual thing, that was Wells, our drummer. Wells, he's not on that record really. He was sick the day we cut that track. So Jerry Murata played drums. Larry and John and I sang it, and Wells, I think, put a tambourine on it. And when it came to the bass part, Wells did that. But John wasn't satisfied with Wells's performance, so he insisted on punching a couple of notes inside that. So it's actually Wells with John together. There was no auto-tune, there was no fixing like that. It was nothing like that. So in order to get the absolute low note or whatever it was that John insisted on, they both had to be a conglomerate to sing that one little part.
I could never get that when my band used to do that song.
But we can't do it live either. We pretend.
Yeah, you guys kill it every time you do it.
Well, I put a little octavizer on there, and it sounds great.
It's very low.
Hey, Mark, so I'm going to just get right into this because this is something I've been waiting to ask.
Oh, God. Here we go.
Mark Andes, you're living in Topanga Canyon there in the valley in the late 60s. It was a notable time. Music was exploding. There's a huge social movement going on. It was hot political climate. Hunter Thompson was covering politics for every hip publication of the time. And Nixon was just elected. And there's Mark Andes at his home in L.A. taking it all in when a knock comes on the door. And when you answer, there's this short, dark-haired, dirty hippie standing there. And why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, that was my little brush with Charlie Manson. Well, first of all, let me just say that the movie, Quentin Tarantino's movie, Once Upon a Time, I'm telling you, that is a slice of my life.
Yeah, I thought it was a great movie. How accurate was it?
Mainly because I grew up in Chatsworth, it's very close to Simi Valley, and the Spawn Ranch was right there. Randy and Cass had moved to New York. Randy was playing with Jimi Hendrix. We put Western Union together. We auditioned at Terry Melcher's place, and he passed on us within a few months.
Is that when the Manson thing happened, like a couple months later, where he went to his place?
Yes, correct. What I'm saying is that movie is such a slice of my life. But we're sitting in Topanga. I'm in my little room with a lot of windows. And Barry Hansen, Dr. Demento was living there. Jay was there. And talk about Butterfield. They would come in, and because of Barry Hansen's record collection, all these blues guys would come and seek out Barry. So I got to meet all these wonderful guys. So we were probably getting loaded in my room. Here comes this guy, all scratched up. He was naked.
He was naked?
Totally naked and scratched up and obviously out of his mind. And I'm thinking, okay, well, he's just high. I didn't realize that he was really out of his mind. But we said, come on in, clean up, here's a T-shirt, but and we sent him on his way. We had no idea who he was. I didn't care. He just looked like one of the many kind of hippies that were hanging out at the time. But he was really.
Well, when did you realize that who it was? When were the Bianca Tate? When did that happen? Those murders?
I don't know the timeline from that experience to the murders. It's kind of a.
Was it a close, but pretty short time period?
It might have been maybe 10 months or something. It wasn't like the next week or anything, but
oh, okay.
Yeah, that happened. And the interesting thing was that whole Spawn Ranch thing happened very close to where I grew up in Chatsworth. So when you watch the movie, Brad Pitt's character is picking up the hitchhiker girl, and then he says, "Oh, you're going out to Chatsworth?" That's where I grew up.
Small world in L.A.
Yeah, yeah.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that, Mark. That was like one of the most incredible stories I've ever heard you say, and I just wanted to.
I know it really happened.
To have you that is so surreal that happened.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Well, let's go back to the 60s with Lance for a moment. Tell us all about the story of how Dancing in the Moonlight came to be and Orleans' relationship with it.
So Larry went off to college early. He went to Ithaca. My parents, there wasn't a music biz for them like was emerging at that time. So they couldn't see him. They didn't want him he had to have something to fall back on, right? So you got to go study, be a music teacher. And that was the last thing he wanted to do. But he was 16. They sent him off to college in Ithaca. He got in this band and that band, and he quit college, and they taught him to go back. He had a second time and then before he quit for good in Ithaca. Now, the last band he was in there was a band called Boffalongo. Boffalongo was a quartet that had a deal on United Artists, made a record, and then almost everybody in the band changed except for Larry, and they had to make it a second record with that roster. At the tail end of that record, this guy named Sherman Kelly, who was an Ithaca native, had a song called Dancing in the Moonlight. They recorded that and added it onto the tail end of the record. That's one piece of the puzzle. Now, Sherman's brother was Wells Kelly, and he was just a phenomenal drummer, among other things. Larry had heard him play and wanted to be in a band with him. So Boffalongo evolved into Larry, Wells Kelly, Sherman Kelly, a couple other guys. Details will get too crazy. It's kind of like Buffalo Springfield birthed how many bands? It's like that. So Larry and Wells and Sherman and they were in the last incarnation of that band. And what broke that band up, so we got two things. We got Dancing in the Moonlight already recorded by a version of Boffalongo, but not the final version of that band. When Wells quit that band, it put the final nail in that coffin, and he quit it to go to Woodstock to play with John Hall to try to start a different band. And they had other guys, went through a couple of permutations, and then Wells said, let's get Larry. So they recruited him down from Ithaca to Woodstock, and that's when the trio that became Orleans for real started. In one of the very first, from the very first gig, they played Dancing in the Moonlight. It's just one of those songs that works, right? So it predated Orleans. It has a history written by the brother of our drummer, all that stuff. And then we played it every gig up until the time King Harvest had a hit on it. Now, King Harvest was the other offshoot of that, where Sherman Kelly and this guy, D.R. Robinson, who was another Boffalongo alumnus bassist, he was the lead singer on that, and some other guys from Ithaca. So when the Boff split up, it became Orleans, it became King Harvest, splintered in that. And once they had a hit on it, of course, it's not cool to play a cover of a current hit of another band when you're trying to be a non-cover band. So we stopped playing that song for the longest time, but in 2005, we actually made a CD where that is the title cut and put our own stamp on it. So that song goes back, to 69 or so.
Is that Boffalongo version available anywhere?
On our website, for anybody interested, there's 2 Boffalongo CDs available. They're digitized, and occasionally I get orders for them because people want to go deep.
Yes.
We did a 40th year reunion in Ithaca a few years back, and I made a composite version of Dance in the Moonlight, which was the live cut from Boffalongo, really high energy, cut into King Harvest version, cut into Orleans version. That's a very cool recording I have.
Wow. I got a question for both of you guys, and we can start with Lance, because this would apply specifically to both of you. From the perspective of a musician moving to town, being not from a certain town that you're moving to, is it more crowded in Nashville or Austin, do you think? Because Lance, you moved to Nashville, and Mark, you moved to Austin, two of the bigger music towns. Granted, you guys came from some pedigree, but when you guys moved to those towns, was it really crowded? Was the scene really going on right then?
I was fortunate. Our band has a history of rise and fall, right? So after the second record, and we crashed and burned in 82, and then we limped along, and then John came back in 85, and then we did a Nashville record, and that ran its course, and then John quit again in 87, and in 88, I was in Woodstock with no work and nothing going on, and got divorced. It was a really bad year. Just at the turn of 89, I got a fortuitous phone call from an old friend who I hadn't heard from in 10 years, but he and his wife had come to Nashville and gotten an RCA deal, by and by, and had top 10 records, and they were going out on a tour, and their bass player, singer, had quit. And did I want this gig? So I got lifted up out of a low point in my life in Woodstock, and was imported to Nashville for work with work, which is like the best way to come, right? So I was supported when I got here. Now, can't say I made the most of that. I'm still kind of a unknown quantity in this town. My career has been external. I'm not a big session player, not a big writer. I'm not, that's not what I do.
Right, you didn't have any reason to break in there. You were just kind
That's
of
right.
living there. Yeah.
There's so many great players here.
But you do the Rocket Men thing. So what is it like, playing around the scene? Is it crowded?
I was just fortunate, right? So I had a real gig, and even though it wasn't making me rich, it was a lot better than guys going down to Broadway and playing for $40 a night, 5 hours, And that still goes on, tip jar and all that, because there's so much talent and so many people wanting to be seen. Pay scale is low. The thing you're talking about, the Rocket Men, it's an Elton John tribute band that I got invited to participate in, and I didn't know if I wanted to do that, but I checked it out, and the guys were really good. And we just decided to rehearse a while, and then we started doing some gigs. And so we play occasionally, right? We might play, if we're lucky, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a year, 8 maybe.
Sort of a guilty pleasure kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's a cool thing, and we're good at it, but it's not, nobody can commit to it over a real gig, can't prioritize it, so we have to all be available. And there's only so many places to play, and fewer actually than there were, so there's no place to play right now, but I wouldn't want to have that be my mainstay.
What about Austin, Mark? Was it pretty crowded with folks when you got there?
Yeah, it was very similar to how Lance describes Nashville. I mean, everybody playing, even the good players. I moved to Austin from Taos, New Mexico with Eliza Gilkison. We were a couple for a while and moved there. And I guess the most soul-satisfying gig I wound up with was with Ian McLagan. But I played with Alejandro Escovedo and John D. Graham. And
That's Sheila's uncle, Alejandro?
Sheila's cousin. I think
there's a few Escovedos out there.
There's a bunch of them, and they're all talented. And so I played with a lot of really good people. But what Lance described as, $40 a night and a tip jar, that was happening even with. I played with Ian McLagan for years for tips only at the Lucky Lounge.
When you got to Austin, what was the lineup of folks that you would see on the regular? Like, who was at the Continental and who was at Antone's and who, what were the normals there?
Well, Tony Price had a Tuesday afternoon gig that was amazing. It was like a happy hour gig. The Resentments, Asleep at the Wheel was always playing, and the Continental Club had...
What year did you move to Austin?
1997.
Probably Bob Schneider was playing.
Bob Schneider had a big old residency, and Eric Johnson would play, Threadgills. And
these people, if you don't know, if you haven't been to Austin, these are tiny places.
Yeah.
These are really tiny places. So imagine seeing Eric Johnson at like CBGB's or something.
Yeah, it was...
But it was crowded. So if you were a musician who didn't have pedigree, is it hard? It seems like it would be really hard to get on in those cities. Even harder than it is in LA if you were just gung-ho, like I'm a musician and I'm going to move to Austin or I'm going to move to Nashville and make it, like.
I realized that I couldn't make a living in Austin. Seriously. So I was fortunate enough to align myself with people that were touring and still barely making a living. So
yeah, but you had all that cushy heart money to fall back on.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It was not an easy time. I'm glad I did it. It was too many musicians and nobody was making... I played with some really wonderful people and made some good music, made some good records. But boy, it was There's just too much talent and not enough of a way to monetize it. It was just difficult to monetize anything.
There's a million places in Austin to play. That just shows you something about how much talent there is there.
Right. But nobody makes any money doing it. That's the thing.
No.
Except for the people that have these lucrative residency gigs, like Bob Snyder.
Right. It seems like a good springboard, though, if you can get accepted by that city, if the city takes you in, so to speak, like it did with Bob, it can be very lucrative for you in the long run. But, that's the long gamble, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. And the irony is that Jim Lauderdale put a band together that I was lucky enough to be involved with I played with Kelly Willis. Jim put a band together, all Austin guys. I was one of them. We played Europe more than we played Austin. The allure of Austin in Switzerland and Germany and England, it was astounding, really, because we had much more of a following there than in Austin. It was pretty funny.
Lance, I want to know if you've been informed what Orleans material was lost in the Universal Fire.
I heard something about this, and I think the answer is nothing. I think it all survived because we are attempting to get the rights to all their stuff. And that would include ABC Records, the Nashville record in '85, which was MCA Nashville, the Forever album, and the one after it. They're all MCA properties. But we have never once, not only not seen a royalty, we've never seen a statement from MCA. So our mutual manager, Len Vico, is on the case exploring getting all those rights back.
Wow.
Because they're not doing anything with it.
Well, if you need a good entertainment attorney, I know one that I can recommend.
Speaking of rights and lawsuits, Mark, it's time that we go here. So Spirit was a well-known band back in the day, and you guys made some groundbreaking records, and correct me if I'm wrong, but financial success didn't really find the band in the early years. And when I talked to a lot of people about this lawsuit with Taurus and Led Zeppelin, and it's funny how they easily dismiss the merit in Spirit's accusation. And I get this a lot more from people who have no idea who Spirit was. It's usually like this blind, unconditional love for Led Zeppelin. And this really kind of shows the power that record labels had, like news media, to convince people to make a judgment without knowing one fact. But when I talk to you, someone who was actually there around during the whole thing, it's a different vibe. And I just want to point out that you have no dog in this race. Like, you get no money for this lawsuit, and it was literally 50 years ago. So I think we can have an honest discussion about this, if for no other reason than to just tell the story with someone who was there and just get it, in the institutional memory of the internet, so to speak. It wasn't just that finger picking of the lick from Taurus that Led Zeppelin took. I mean, let's talk about Randy's theremin. Let me just set the stage. Led Zeppelin played gigs with Spirit, and Randy and Jimmy Page knew each other. There's a lawsuit going on maintaining that Led Zeppelin took the lick from Stairway to Heaven, copied exactly from a Spirit song, Taurus. And when you play the two records together, it's literally the same thing. So this is what we're talking about. But Mark, can you just comment on your take on this whole thing? Because I really find it interesting to get the take from someone who was there.
Well, it's been decided, and it was decided by the Ninth Circuit Court that Led Zeppelin did not plagiarize Randy's song.
Okay, so the ruling happened then already.
Ruling has happened, so Spirit has lost. In a way, I kind of have to take semi-blame or credit for. I got a call from a guy who writes for the Bloomberg News, and he wanted to do an interview about this very topic. I said, okay, I'd be glad to. And he showed up with a coffee table book from a guy that documented all of the songs with beautiful pictures. And apparently the author of the book really was a Led Zeppelin fan, but was unflinching about their tendency to borrow songs. And he played for me a Howard Stern episode with the author of the book. So I had the book, and I'm listening to this interview with Howard Stern and this guy, and I'm realizing, holy mackerel, these guys And you're right. The very first gig that Led Zeppelin ever did in the United States, they opened for Spirit and Vanilla Fudge in Denver. And we did...
You did a handful of shows with them, though, and they were pretty big shows, right?
Yeah, like 7 or 8 shows. Yeah, something consequential gigs, like we were the group right before or right after. I remember in Blackpool, England, Jimmy and Robert came to the show and then hung out with us in a pub, and Robert showing us how to play snooker, which is really different than pool. And that was the night that driving home from us playing snooker, he got into that horrific car wreck. We had this interaction, and it was very interesting being in court with those guys sitting, 15 feet away. And Jay Ferguson and I could not bring the suit, as it turns out. I said to the attorney that wound up representing Spirit or Randy's estate, as it turns out, I think we should do this. I think if Randy ever deserves a shot of getting any credit, that this is the last gasp of that happening. If it doesn't happen now, meaning back then, it's not going to happen. And I sort of pulled the trigger on it. I would have brought the suit had I been able to, but as it turns out, Randy's estate brought the suit, and I was a friendly witness and all that.
Are you credited on writing Taurus?
No.
Okay, right.
I think it was mainly because of the estate. I'm not sure. That was the only writing contribution Randy made for the first record. And for the first 3 or 4 records, we split everything up evenly. All the publishing, all of the writing went even Steven. Writers got credit, but we split everything up.
So it must have been weird having to be in court with those guys after you had this very personal, time with them back in the day. Did you ever run into Robert in Austin? Because he was down there.
No, I didn't, but I ran into him in 82 when Heart was opening up for Queen. Robert came to the show, and there's this funny shot of me in these really short shorts and talking with, and there's Ann and Nancy and Robert and Denny, and we're all just hanging out. And I think it's kind of like going, oh, yeah, I remember you from back in the Spirit days. And he went, oh, really?
What a charmed life, man. Just we were hanging out with Heart, and Led Zeppelin was there. And wow, amazing.
Well, and we were opening up for Queen. I mean, that was amazing.
Here's another one for both of you guys, real quick. Both of you guys have had the opportunity to tour with Fleetwood Mac. Mark in 76 with Firefall on the Rumors tour. You were on that, right?
Yes, yeah, it sure was.
And then Lance in 95 with the REO and Pat Benatar combo. So can you guys talk about these experiences a bit? Because I have to imagine that Fleetwood Mac in the 70s was a much different vibe than Fleetwood Mac in the mid-90s.
You think?
I mean, was it pretty cut and dry, like no craziness or anything going on when you were... Because there was a pretty big package, too.
It was called the Can't Stop Rockin' Tour. It was REO Speedwagon and Fleetwood Mac trading off it, headlining night to night. And Pat Benatar was the third act. And it was just Larry and me and John. And we were the acoustic hors d'oeuvre, as so to speak. We'd play our 15 or 20 minutes on that show and then move on to the next one.
We got to add another act to the gig. All right, no drum kits, though.
Yeah, so that band, but that Fleetwood was not, what we think of as the Fleetwood Mac. Of course, there were many versions of that band, but everyone thinks of it with Stevie and Lindsay and, that band. But this was Mick and John, and it was Dave Mason, Billy Burnett, and Becca Bramlett was the band, and Steve, somebody on keys. So it wasn't...
That's nothing to scoff at.
No, it was good, but it wasn't... It was before their reunion and all that. So it was a different version of the band. And like I say, we were just thrown onto the front end of that, and I'm grateful for that.
Firefall opened up a bunch of Fleetwood Mac shows. And
yeah, what was the Mac like during the Rumors era? Because that was the juicy stuff right there.
Yeah, they were as good as they were on record. Mick Fleetwood wound up managing Firefall there for a minute.
What?
I toured with Stevie called the Whole Lot of Trouble Tour, and it was kind of a prophetic name for the tour because it was a crazy time. I mean, it was larger than life, you could say. Larger than life. It was pretty amazing. And both bands happened to be really hitting on all cylinders. Firefall wasn't totally self-destructing yet.
Rick and Larry were like on the money at that point?
Yeah, they weren't totally self-destructive yet. Of course, we only had to play 35 or 40 minutes per night, so that left a lot of time for everybody to get in trouble. But we managed to marshal our forces to come off well, and they liked us. Mick wanted to manage us there for a minute, and they were good times.
We're running into time here, so I'll let Alan ask one more, and then I'll ask one more, and then we'll wrap it up with these guys. So, Al, if you want to hit Mark with your spirit questions, go for it now.
I think I managed to slide in most of them, other than my incredible undying love of everything spirit. But I'd like to ask both of you, because you've played so much music with so many different people in so many different ways, is there something that each of you does not have a copy of that you'd absolutely kill to have a copy of, some recording? Are
you meaning of their bands?
Yes. I don't know who has the demos that Spirit did with Dr. Demento. Maybe that is like, oh, I wish I had something like that you would absolutely kill if you could have a copy of what you did at a certain date with a certain number of people.
Well, I'll jump in. The Spirit stuff has been so well archived. I mean, just about everything that we ever did has been out there in some form or another. I don't know. I really don't have anything.
Nothing's missing.
I think everything that, even the embarrassing stuff that I really don't want out there is out there. I'll tell you, there's a project that never saw the light of day. It was an Austin project with Pat Mostellato, Malford Milligan, and Phil Brown was the guitar player. It was called MP2. That never saw the light of day. There is a crazy inside-out version, an arrangement that Pat Mostellato and I did of I Got a Line on You that is crazy, and I don't have a copy of it. That would be kind of interesting to hear. MP2. It was like Malford and Mark and Pat and Phil Brown was the guitar. So there was 2 M's and 2 P's. So MP2 is the name of the band. Pretty amazing musicians. One record, and that was it. So that might be one.
How about you, Lance?
I'm searching my memory bank here, and I kind of have to go the other way because fortunately there's a lot of documentation of Orleans, both live and in studio. A lot was captured audio-wise, even from the early days. I have a friend named Sky Schrody, and he's an archivist, not of only of us, but his other favorite acts. And he's got a library so deep and rich of us that when we went to make a 30th year live from the vaults kind of thing, we just asked him to find the best stuff. He came up with a bunch of it. So it's pretty deep. There's some video. I just uploaded, well, we're going to upload one of Spring Fever any day, to YouTube again. But there's a show at Capitol Theater in Passaic from 76. The entire show was captured multi-camera, black and white. So it's nice to have those things, And to go a little further, John, you said, all these names, Joe Elliott from Def Leppard, Billy Ocean.
Oh, right. Yeah, the corporate shows. Yeah.
Larry, how to condense this. Larry was one of many singers in an organization with one backup band run by a shyster. And he took that thing over and made a mutiny and left with the singers, did a different band, Florida-based band. And that was himself and Lane and Charlie Morgan and some ringers down there.
Did he learn from Rodney Justo? That's
I don't know the reference, but I'll bypass that. So I got into that band as a latecomer. It was one 5-6-piece band who would back up dozens of different singers. Felix from the Rascals, or Joe Bouchard from Blue Oyster Cult, or Dave Pack from Ambrosia, a wide variety of people. So when Larry passed, there was this one corporate account we have down in Orlando, the biggest buyer. They have an annual event, and the concho came to me, said, "Can you make this thing happen?" And I said, "Sure." So I took that over. I went from the bottom of the totem pole to the top. And that band is just off the charts. Great. I'm the weakest player in the band, but I'm the band leader, so they can't fire me. We've had the opportunity to play with, like I said, over 100, 150 maybe name acts over the past 10 years. Everything from Def Leppard to Four Tops to Motley Crue. I mean, you name it, all kinds of genres. So that's where I've gotten the opportunity to play with all these people, and all of it has been captured. All of it is post-mix DVD produce the stuff. So
Really? Will it ever see the light of day?
no, it's in-house only, right? So they make this thing for the attendees. About 2,000 people come. It's an in-house corporate thing. But these performances are just stellar and such a wide variety of artists that I would never have gotten to work with if not for that hookup. Ironic, it's ironic that with Larry's passing, all this opportunity would come my way. Strange way to get the blessing, but I'm sure he'd be proud of me and I'm proud of him.
Well, I could see why you'd want a copy of that just to say, like, I did this.
I've got I've got years of those DVDs, one after another, and it's great to have all that archives.
Oh, you do have it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I got them all.
That's great.
But you guys don't record Caravan of the Stars when you do that in Tennessee, right?
No, and that's kind of like the mom and pop nickel budget version of this $1 million affair we do every year. So he's referring to a show out in Jackson, Tennessee twice a year. It's an oldie show, very oldie, like Bobby Tillett's an oldie, like should have retired oldie. But that's an 8-act show all the time, and I like doing it. It's a lot of work for not much money, but I just like the variety. Orleans has been the backbone of my career, but in the last decade plus, it's become less of the mainstay, about a third of what I do.
Lance, you're the only guy that there's been a few people that have filled in for Mark when he's had to take a sabbatical earlier on in 2018 and or 2019. Or when was it? Maybe it was 2018.
Last year.
Yeah, last year. Taking nothing away from Johnny and the other guys who've filled in. You're like the only guy who hits the Strange Way bass line, right?
Well, apparently I have a pretty good bio clock is what I call it. I just know these tempos.
You're a great bass player. That's why I want to hear this band with all these other guys. If you're the weak link, I mean, geez.
Yeah, some of the time I get to play bass in that band, but there's such another good bass player who precedes me. So I came in as a utility guy, playing percussion and acoustic guitar and doing backup and setting up the stage and all that. But more recently, I've been playing more bass. And a couple of years ago, Barry couldn't even make the show, and I had such a good time, and that is such a good show. And plus, I got to remix the thing with my engineer buddy, and we would fix everything. We'd tune everything, fix everything. Herculean project. So I actually appear to be better than I am on those recordings.
All right, so last question for both of you guys. Out of 50 years, or in Mark's case, probably more, of playing gigs in this business, give us one of the top 3 highlights. Give us one of the big highlights from your careers. If you need to take a minute, I mean, I'm sure there's been quite a few. So,
well, there was the Fillmore East was kind of legendary for having some great shows, and I remember the Bonzo Dog Band and the Kinks and Spirit played, I think, 3 nights, and it was amazing. Also, Spirit opened up for Buddy Rich.
What?
The real opening act was a 50-piece steel drum band. So it was this crazy night with all these steel drummers, Spirit, and then Buddy Rich. So I've been really lucky to have played with a lot of different people. But the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band and the Kinks and Spirit, that was pretty awesome. And I had this crazy interaction. I walked up to the Kinks dressing room, and there was some stuff going on that I can't describe on radio. It was pretty intense.
What year was that?
I think 69.
69 at the Fillmore East, because the Fillmore East was only around for a couple of years.
Yeah, like 3 years or 4 years. Something
Right.
Like that, yeah.
Lance, how about you? What's up there in the top 3? Give us a good one.
There's a lot of memorable ones. I'd say any gig we did with Little Feat was great. I just loved them. And Lowell was live. It was that band, they're at their height. I guess playing with the Wailers, Bob Marley and the Wailers at Paul's Mall in Boston in 73.
Wow.
When we were pretty much the only band doing Americanized reggae. That was an honor.
Did you get to talk with Bob? Did you hang out with him?
No, I didn't talk to anybody.
Remember, he was shy.
I was shy and I was high. And,
Yeah.
that was my remedy. Like, just stay.
That was probably the same story with Bob.
I know. I get it. I'll tell you how much I didn't talk. I was such a big Jackson Browne fan. I just loved his work. And we went on tour with him for the whole summer of 76. I never had one conversation with the guy. Never once. That'll tell you. You'd be surprised.
Wow, 76 must have been a hell of a year. Firefall was out with Fleetwood Mac. You were out with Jackson.
Still the One was a summer hit. Yeah, it was the heyday.
The height of the 70s scene.
And as the guy on the other end of those shows, watching you all. It was just an amazing time to be a music fan, to be able to see all of these incredible bands live at very reasonable prices right up front. Just a beautiful time to be a music fan.
We could talk to you guys all night. There's probably a million other stories we could get to, but it's been a while. We're kind of hitting time. So if you folks at home want to check out what's going on with Lance, it's Orleans.com. Is that right?
It's Orleans Online.
I just want to take a moment. I got to ask you about this because this is a question I missed, and I did want to get to it. Back in the day, when you guys picked your name, it was pretty distinguishable. You just say Orleans, the band. But in the day of the internet, has that become a problem?
That name has always been a problem. It was before my time when they were a trio, after they'd done their first really good gig at some club, nameless band, right? And the club owner says, we want you back, but what do we call you? Because got to have a name. So among the three of them, they argued for a long time before Wells spat out Orleans and nobody objected too much. And I said, okay, we'll use that. We'll change it. Yeah. Well, never got changed. Got a record deal. Can't change it. Can't change the brand. But nobody knew. You couldn't find it in a Google search because all you get is New Orleans references. So it doesn't really serve us well in that regard. And we're not from New Orleans. No, we're from New York, and so on and so forth. So it is what it is.
Right, because if you want to search for the New Orleans CD,
yeah,
it's difficult.
But there is Orleans County, New York.
Yeah, there is. It's not the easiest thing to find. So if you want to find us, it's orleansonline.com. That's our antiquated website, but at least the tour dates are up to speed. Or you can find us on Facebook at Orleans Music. I think it is Facebook, Orleans Music.
Oh, also, and you play with Felix, too. Well, when shows start again, you'll still be playing with Felix, yes?
I'm on call with Felix. I'm not his main guy. Got to do 20 shows with him last year in his Rascals, and I've done many before that. So it comes and goes. I'm not counting on that, but sometimes I get the call.
Once in a while, you might see Lance playing with Felix as well, and Mark plays with Firefall. You can check out them at, is it firefall.net now, or what is it, Mark?
Firefallofficial.net.
That's right, firefallofficial.net. And we'll post all these links in the show notes and also on the webpage. I want to thank you guys for taking the time and just sharing some of these stories with us. It's a blast to talk to you guys always. It's two of the nicest guys in the music business, I swear.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Alan. And Lance, God, it's great to hear your stories, brother. This has been fun for me.
We just learned a bunch about each other, huh?
I mean, we did, huh?
Soft Pass is a Wiggle the Wire audio production. We'd like to thank our bus drivers, Kent C. Straight and Miles Tugo, our audio advisors, Stereo Blaren and Microphone, studio lights by Annie Position, our house electrician is Maxwell Power, our union steward, Manny Kin, our monitor engineer, Tad Moore, our music transposer, Betty Dropped It, our staff bartenders, Ryan Koch and Brandy Decanter, our bluegrass music supervisor, Amanda Lynn, our accountant, Owen Cash, our cleanup crew supervisor, Armand Hammer, catering by Candace Spencer and Bill Loney, our valet, Ford Parker, and our guitar tech, Rusty Steele. For Alan Tillis, I'm John Michaels saying thanks for listening.
This has been Soft Pass. Find us on Facebook at Soft Pass Podcast. Special thanks to Blue Microphones and the law firm of Schulman Rogers. Theme music by the Sam Yannis Band. Join us again next time for more stories about the entertainment industry.